Good morning, afternoon, whatever time it might be where you're at. This is the first lecture for Political Science 104, Introduction to Political Theory. I'm your professor, David Selby. Today we're going to be talking about what is political theory. That's the most important thing we're going to cover in this lecture. We're also going to go over a few of the basic ways in which philosophers make arguments. We're only going to be beginning this activity of how philosophers make arguments, and the reason for that is it takes a while to get good at it, but you'll get better. So today we're going to just take the basics. So what is political theory? One of the things we need to keep in mind is that political theory is not political science. Political science is concerned exclusively with explaining political behavior. Why did somebody vote the way they did? International relations, why do states do things like invade, why does war happen? Political theory is not concerned with the explanatory endeavor as much as it is the normative endeavor. What should we do? This is one of the things that makes political theory fun, is that we get to talk about what should we do. It might sound easy. A lot of our political conversations sort of do come down to disagreements over this question of what we should do, but it's much more complex than you might think at the beginning. So we'll ask questions about justice, human rights, democracy, lots of fun stuff we get to ask questions about. Now, the key question here is using our reason in order to make consistent arguments in favor of one thing or another, okay, or against something. Sadly, I like this. It's not a great argument. I get that you like it, we all like stuff, but a lot of contemporary political discourse, even though it's trying to do this sort of normative should thing, it really comes down to I just like or don't like this or that. We want to try to stay away from that mode of argument, okay? Arguments themselves, this is just very basic, sort of getting us underway, so you don't need to memorize this yet. I'm going to give you a fuller lecture, sort of how to link your arguments together. But arguments themselves in this class need to have these four things. First, a foundation. Okay, there's multiple options. I'm going to take you through your three main options today, but you begin with a foundation. Then you also have intermediary steps that connect the foundation of your argument to factual evidence, other types of considerations to sort of, it's like a train. Everything is linked together. You want to keep it all linked together. And those intermediary steps connect to a conclusion that should clearly state, this is what this argument proves, okay? Or what I think it proves. Clearly states the should part of your argument, as I have put it here. And then finally, all arguments need to be qualified, okay? So a clear statement of the limits of your argument. Arguments are never absolute, and the careful consideration of counter-arguments and qualifications is essential, okay? Let me give you one example here. The difference in what we're trying to do could be described as the difference between being a judge and a lawyer. Lawyers, they are obligated by law to defend their client to the best of their ability, hell or high water. Doesn't matter if they think their client is guilty or they know he's guilty. Doesn't matter if they know they're making arguments that quite honestly are kind of bunk, just aren't going to work. They have to defend their client with all of their energy. This leads lawyers sometimes to go for the and another thing strategy, which is just throw everything into a pot and see what sticks, okay? So lawyers are out there, we're not 100% certain, so we don't know anything, right? They'll do that kind of thing. Or, it could be this, it could be that, and another thing. That's how lawyers tend to argue. This is not what we're trying to do in philosophy. If your papers read like a bunch of disconnected reasons with no logical steps in between them, no choice of a foundation, you're going down the wrong path, right? What philosophy helps us do is it helps us structure and give order to the arguments that we're making. And sometimes you can't make two arguments at the same time. We'll look at some examples of that. So what we're trying to do looks a lot more like what the judge in a legal proceeding is trying to do, right? Judges only care about the rules of legal reasoning. Are they being properly applied? They also care about getting the facts right? But what they care about is applying the logic of judicial reasoning correctly, period. Okay? That's very similar to philosophy, except our criteria is not the rule of law. It's not judicial rules. Our criteria are philosophical rules, ways of arguing. So as long as you're using the philosophical rules properly, your argument's going to be pretty solid. So the basics, like I said, all arguments begin with a foundation. A foundation is where you start your argument, okay? This way of thinking is very much like building a house, right? Houses also have foundations, so this is kind of a helpful analogy for us to think about what foundation is doing for us in philosophical life. And just picture whatever kind of house you want to build, the type of foundation you lay is going to affect what you can put on top of it. Okay, so if you have a wood foundation, maybe you can't build as high. Concrete foundation is going to have its own benefits, but maybe earthquakes are a problem. I'm not a construction worker, so I don't know exactly how the house part of this works, but I know how the philosophy part works very well. So there you go. So there's no singular right foundation, right? That's the other thing to keep in mind here. But rather there's a set of trade-offs, of choices and trade-offs between different kinds of philosophical foundations, right? There are 5 relatively common foundations. Something like 98% of all political philosophers are using one of these 5. We're really going to focus on 3 in this class. I'm just going to briefly talk about the other 2. They do come up at times. I'll have longer lectures on them later, but they're harder, right? So we have 3 sort of intro foundations, which kind of like if we were actually building a house, I would say, look, here's your 3 basic foundations. You can build houses doing these 3 things pretty easily. And then there's more advanced ways of laying your foundation that maybe have their purposes, but they're for a little bit more advanced builders, okay? So we're going to start you guys off with the basics. But I will indicate, here's some of this, here's some of that, especially later in the semester, and give you a little bit more systematic analysis of these other ways of thinking. But most of you are going to be doing the 3 we'll be talking about today. You're going to be sort of pretty happy with one of them. There are some differences between these foundations, but there are differences within the foundation. So, not every person who builds a house, a foundation out of wood, is doing it exactly the same way. But we can recognize there's wood builders, there's concrete builders, etc. Let me give you another analogy to kind of think about political philosophy and what we're doing here. This time I'd like to give you an analogy with martial arts, right? Just like philosophy, martial arts is broken down into different fighting styles or schools of fighting. And these different styles of fighting each have their virtues and vices. They each are able to do different things well, and then they're also weak to certain types of things. And each style, we could say, begins with a foundation. They do kind of these philosophical ways of thinking about why they fight the way they do. So I'm only going to do 2. There's lots of kung fu, lots of martial arts styles, probably more than philosophical styles, lots of different ways of fighting. But 2 basic ways are kung fu and judo. Okay, so Kung Fu, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, the sort of movie style of fighting that we see a lot. Lots of kicking and punching, very acrobatic, almost gymnastic-like at times. But the main point here with Kung Fu is kicking and punching. That's how they fight, right? Classic martial arts style of thinking. On the other hand, Judo is more like wrestling, right? They don't kick and punch that much. The goal in judo is to grapple your opponent and then use your opponent's weight against him or her, and take them down to the ground, do lots of throws, holds, all this kind of stuff. That's judo. So judo actually mixes well with Western wrestling, and kung fu is a little bit more like a boxing style of fighting. So depending on what style you choose, it will change how you fight and even what your strategy is for winning, right? A judo fighter, if you watch MMA, I don't actually think it's rather boring, but a judo fighter is always trying to close the distance with his opponent so he can grab them, and then once he has his hands on you, you're in big trouble, right? Whereas a kicker and puncher who's using more of a kung fu style of fighting, he needs to maintain that distance, and so he can have space for his kicking and fighting. In this case, kung fu actually looks a little bit more like liberalism, which is what we're going to talk about in a little bit. Next, we're going here. And judo looks a little bit more like republicanism. Warning, these words do not mean what you think they mean. Okay, let's talk about our foundations, and this is what I just sort of was talking about. This slide is hugely important, okay? So the intro stuff is not too terribly difficult to understand, but this is where the lecture is really taking off, and things here are terribly important. So when we talk about liberalism, philosophically, we do not mean someone who is a member of the Democratic Party in the United States. The word liberal is used popularly in a different way than it is used philosophically, okay? This is an open secret amongst political science professors, and it just has to do with sort of the particularities of American political development in our own culture. And it's a bigger story. We don't have to worry about that right now. But to give you an example, libertarian, which is a conservative, sort of Republican Party way of thinking, libertarian, they are liberals, okay? They're conservative, fiscally especially, economically especially, but they are making the same style of argument that liberals, who some of them are on the left, will also make. So they're fighting in the same style, although they think it leads them to sort of different conclusions. So liberal philosophers, and this is like your greatest hits of names, include John Locke, who we have some readings from this week, Immanuel Kant, who we do not read, Thomas Hobbes, again, massively important, we read him this week, John Rawls and Robert Nozick. Rawls and Nozick are two contemporary, well, Rawls passed away recently, but 20th century political philosophers who were doing liberalism and sort of applying it to contemporary events. Rawls was a kind of lefty liberal, Nozick is a righty liberal, okay? So Nozick's a libertarian, Rawls is just a lefty kind of liberal guy, okay? Liberals make arguments from individual rights. This is like where they all begin. Sometimes they construct individual rights differently, but liberals all begin from the premise that individual rights are more important than, say, collective self-determination or class analysis, as Marx will do. Okay, so that's how liberals are doing it. And this is the Kantian, so this is Immanuel Kant's formulation. We might tinker with this. Locke is a little bit different, but this is a good summation. It really hits sort of the highlights of what liberalism is doing. Why do you have rights? Well, rights, you get rights because you are a being endowed with reason, and you are due a certain amount of respect. So reason gives you free will, the ability to be what Kant would say morally autonomous. That just means make up your own mind and set your own rules for things, okay? That's what Kant is doing. Locke's a little bit different, Nozick's a little bit different, but this is a good summation of a lot of the liberal push is you get rights because you have reason, okay? Second school of thought, republicanism. Again, you could be a Democrat and be a small r Republican. You could be a Republican Party, that's capital R, and be a Republican, okay? So if you're, you could be a cultural conservative, that would put you here under the small r Republican way of thinking, but you could also be a multiculturalist, which is someone who thinks that all the different ethnicities in the United States sort of bring something special, some kind of value to our common life. So all different ethnicities have their sort of own values that they bring to our collective life together. That's a more lefty way of being a smaller Republican. Great Republican philosophers include Aristotle, who is probably the first social scientist, not the first philosopher, but in this class we sort of begin with him because Plato was important, but in political theory, Plato wasn't that persuasive. He did more interesting things in other parts of philosophy, but when Plato turned to look at politics, he wasn't super great. So we're going to start with Aristotle. Aristotle was fantastic. Aristotle set a way of thinking that we still go back to and use today, so Aristotle's important. Montesquieu, Rousseau, Tocqueville, Hume, and Burke, these are all people who are small r Republicans, and we read most of them through this semester. So you really want to pay attention to this slide. Keep this slide in mind because it's kind of helping to organize some of the different names for you. They make arguments from the idea that man is a social animal. That's the Republican foundation, right? Liberals begin with the argument that individuals are due respect of a rational being. Republicans begin from the premise that, from the foundation that man is a social animal, okay? So they begin with the social groups that sort of constitute this part of our nature. And then our third foundation for the day is Marxism, okay? Marxist philosophers include Karl Marx, Robert Owen, Mandel, Cohen. These are other people we'll be reading later. They make arguments from the idea of mode of production, and mode of production is for Marxists, it's an economic relationship that then has many political and cultural consequences. Okay, those are our three big ones. I just want to throw a couple of the harder ones at you now, so you can have a little bit in your brain. Don't get worried about this. We're not reading any of these guys till later, but they are important, so I just want to keep that in your brain. Foundation 4, Hegelianism. So Hegel was this German dude who lived at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. Really important philosopher. He actually influenced Karl Marx, but Marx really does a lot of things very differently. He also influenced the movement known as Romanticism, so lots of 19th century, Hegel's one of the most important philosophers of the 19th century. So, including Hegel, Charles Taylor, and Judith Butler. So Taylor we definitely read, Butler we don't in this class. They make arguments, Hegel makes arguments from the idea that human history is a developmental process moving through various stages of history, and he calls this developmental process or unfolding, he calls it the unfolding of spirit or Geist. I know that's goofy and it doesn't make any sense to you right now. It's not really supposed to yet. I'll explain this later. But Hegel's hard, okay? Hegel's really hard. I can make the other three make sense to you very quickly. There's very little I can do to make Hegel easy, okay? Hegel's just hard. And then Foundation 5, anti-foundationalism, okay? We'll look at more of a little bit of these, a little bit of the Hegelians. Anti-foundational philosophers include Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty. These guys are sometimes called postmodernists, okay? I'll give you a longer analysis of this later. This is a really important philosophical movement from the second half of the 20th century. We're not going to have enough time to engage it super deeply here, but later in the semester we will have a series of readings that will look at what the anti-foundationalists take as basically a criticism of how I'm teaching this class, right? So I'm up here going foundations, we're going to learn foundations, yada yada. And, anti-foundationalists, they seek to show how the foundations themselves serve to structure what we think of as acceptable answers, and therefore are themselves subject of criticism and debate, right? That's why they're considered anti-foundationalists. They're trying to show us how our foundations, they think, rest on shifting sands, or, they're not as solid as we like to think. So they're really starting with this criticism of where we begin. So that's kind of interesting. We'll look at them later. They're cool. The first three foundations. Okay. It's the morning I'm having my tea. Let's start with republicanism, small r republicanism, because it's actually the first reading in our book. Okay, so when you get to the political theory book, it's the first reading. Notice what's the title of this reading? The state exists by nature. By state, Aristotle means politics and the government, right? He means basically human beings are born to live in a government. Which is interesting. Not everyone agrees with that. Remember the foundation? Man is a social animal. Sometimes it actually really is better translated here as man is a political animal. Okay, that's the original translation of Aristotle, but through time, some Republicans have really emphasized more the social and less the political. So there you go. So that's an important difference. And Aristotle thought that political association, the state, he lived in Greece, so it was city-states at that time. Nowadays we would say nation-states, right? We have a nation, which is a group of people. Then you have a government that sort of overlaps the nation and does things for the people, okay? So he thought that the state was natural, the highest form of political organization. And the highest end or telos of persons is participation in the political life of a city. He was Greek, they lived in cities. Aristotle roughly reasoned like this. First, he noticed that wherever he went, people lived together in communities, right? So he was kind of an early social scientist. He used a lot of observation in how he was putting together his theory. So he looks around, he traveled around Greece and went to a lot of the different city-states, wrote a big study of their constitutions and everything. And he said, look, everywhere I go, people more or less are sort of living in communities. There are very few families or individuals who lived alone without any company. Why? So Aristotle then, okay, he sees this, but he needs to now sort of make sense of it. Well, Aristotle noted how individual families are incomplete as a social group, right? So if you were just your family out there in the forest, Aristotle thinks it's sort of incomplete. Why does he think it's incomplete? Well, ask yourself this. Who are you going to marry your kids to, right? Like, kids want to marry somebody when they get of age, and if you're just one family out in the middle of nowhere, you're not going to be able to literally perpetuate yourself, and your kids are going to be really sad, right? So, incomplete. Only the city-state, today again we would say nation-state, was big enough to have everything it needs for complete self-sufficiency, right? So only city-states, you have enough families where you can marry your kids, trade, all of this kind of stuff. Only city-states were able to do all of these things together. This includes military defenses, army, navy, walls, etc., clean water, food, resources, blah, blah, blah. The state was therefore the highest because it didn't need any outside help. It looks like this, right? So this is how I sort of am diagramming this. This is a handwritten. I normally, when I teach in person, I just draw this on the board and have lots of these diagrams. I don't get all of them into the online version, so that's how it goes. But this is sort of Aristotle's thought. If you start with just these individual families, they're incomplete, so they're not enough. Aristotle says, oh, look, families will get together to make a village, but villages are also still incomplete. They don't have enough self-protection. They can't grow enough food. So from many villages, you then form a city-state represented by the outside, and that city-state has a government to run it. The state is complete, right? It has all of its needs secured, including food, water. Aristotle actually spends time talking about these things because a state that cannot, a community that cannot get enough food and water, is going to have a hard time continuing on through life, right? Like self-perpetuating itself. So water and food is terribly important. It's complete because it's complete. Because it's complete, it's also the highest, and therefore the state exists by nature, because we don't choose to live in a state. We simply create one whether we like it or not. Something like families, right? So the analysis of social groups, the only thing Aristotle has against families is he doesn't think they're complete in and of themselves, but he does think families exist again naturally. And, think of it this way. We get to marry who we choose, but no matter who we marry, we form a new family, right? And families take many different forms throughout history. Polygamy and polyamory have actually been very common. So there's not one ideal family that all other families are exactly like. There's not one state that's exactly the right state for all of history. But according to Aristotle, the state is natural, so therefore you are living in a state naturally. Okay, that's just the super basics, okay? What's really important are the notion of telos, the notion of completion or self-sufficiency, and the state exists by nature. Okay, again, these are just the introductory sort of beginnings. I'll have longer lectures on these different foundations as we go. Liberals begin their argument from liberal rights, usually the rights due to being endowed with reason. So that's how I summarized it. Liberals have some important variations in how they conceive of individual rights. They're a little bit less cohesive than Republicans. Let's start with Thomas Hobbes. Okay, so Thomas Hobbes, he's incredibly important. One of the most famous political thinkers of all time. Definitely a liberal, and his notion of the state of nature has been highly influential over the last 600 years or so. Going on, I guess it's only 500 years. It's only 500 years, sorry kids. So, what is a state of nature? Okay, this is a common liberal way of arguing. A state of nature is a hypothetical construction used to determine the boundaries of state power by asking this question: what rights would I have if there were no government, right? So state of nature is this place with no government authority. No government, it's gone, okay? Once you answer this question, you can match that answer to your current government to see how well it is doing, right? So if you have these rights, naturally, we're going to get rid of government, hypothetically. That means it's just a game. It's a sort of thought experiment. We're going to get rid of the government in our thought experiment and then ask, well, what rights would I have if there was no government telling me what my rights are, right? So I'm going to try to deduce this set of rights philosophically, and then I can take that deduction of what rights am I supposed to have, and I can match it to my actual government. So, assuming the United States does a relatively good job at being pretty close to what rights you should have from the state of nature, which I think it probably does. We might have some complaints, but on par, I think it's going to sort of make it through this test. But you might be in North Korea, where you have no freedom of speech. The state could come and take your stuff at any time, no right to participate in any kind of democratic institutions, and North Korea is going to fail the test, right? So what's the state of nature helping us do? It's helping us determine if actual governments are legitimate or not. It's not an actual place. The state of nature does not actually exist. I know sometimes they like to say it does. In an international system of states that are fighting with each other, maybe that's a state of nature. But at least for us normal humans, state of nature doesn't exist in the real world, okay? It's a brain experiment, a brain game. The basic idea is to try to determine what is the proper boundary of state power, or put differently, what rights do I have as an individual the state should be obligated to respect, right? So it's going to give us a kind of baseline, not allowed to violate these types of things. We could take an example. For example, the right to free speech. According to liberals, this is a fundamental right that should only be restricted based upon immediate danger, yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? And if we begin with the idea that men have reason, and then we took away government, but reason would be really important. Why? Because reason would give us a way to talk to each other even without government. So the right of free speech is going to be really important because it's going to be helpful, sort of leading us down to make agreements outside of government. Right? If you have reason, speech is the way you're going to use to express that reason, so it ranks very highly in terms of rights that shouldn't be infringed. Here's another way we could sort of restate the state of nature game. What rules would you agree to if you had the opportunity to set up a government for the first time? Hobbes' state of nature, right? So the different philosophers disagree on the state of nature, and state of nature is one of our biggest readings from this week are all state of nature readings because it's there giving us a lot of their foundational principles, okay? Hobbes' state of nature is only one version of many. Well, to Hobbes, state of nature is a mean, awful place. Life is nasty, brutish, and short is what Hobbes says. Pay attention to David Miller and which is the Political Philosophy, a brief introduction. Pay attention to what he has to say about Hobbes. He does a pretty good job. But basically, Hobbes lived through the English Civil War. It was a mean, nasty war, and it was from his experience living through that war that he came up with the idea of a state of nature. And of course, the Civil War, there's no government there protecting you. It's different parties fighting over who's going to get to run the government. So all heck breaks loose, okay? Notice, however, what a terrible place it is. So Hobbes' state of nature is a place with no rights. People are mean and awful to each other. You have no rights. He calls it a war of all against all. It's a bad, mean, nasty place. But to Hobbes, that's why he likes the state, okay? So if not having a state is this really terrible, awful, nasty place, then having a state is going to take us away, take us out of this awful state of nature, and at least give us some sense of security. Okay? Basically, according to Hobbes, the main thing you need is just to be protected physically. That's actually sort of the heart of the matter. And the state there's no rights, particularly, that the state then has to respect, except that the state is there to protect you and to make sure that other people in society don't use violence upon you, that you can trust them when you make an agreement with them, this type of thing, okay? And so the main thing the main limit for Hobbes is the state can't come after you, okay? State's there to protect you. If the state comes after you, you're absolved of your obligations, you're allowed to run, fight back, whatever you want, okay? But there's a kind of trade of protection for obedience. State gives you protection, you agree to follow the rules. That's what you agree to do. But the state gets to decide what those rules are. Okay, so there's very few limits. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent. That nothing can be unjust. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. So, to Thomas Hobbes, without having the state there, we are in big trouble. So, because the state of nature is so bad, Hobbes thinks that the state plays a central role in organizing human society, right? Aristotle would actually totally agree with this. He would disagree on the state of nature, but, Aristotle would agree the state plays a really important role by creating a power to overawe them all, right? That means a big guy with a lot of guns who has the power to make you be scared, not of your fellow man in society, but of the state. Hobbes thinks the state restrains the violent, antisocial parts of our nature, and it allows us to actually trust one another, okay? It allows us to go about our lives without the fear of death. The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of commodious living, that means luxuries and things, right? You want to have your iPads and all of that. And hope by their industry to attain them. Hope that you can earn an iPad. And reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace upon which men may be drawn to agreement, right? So this is where reason comes in for Hobbes. state of nature is terrible, but because we have reason, we can move out of the state of nature, and basically what reason tells us to do is create a state, okay? Reason first tells us to create a state, and then secondly, he actually has some nice, we're not reading these parts, but basic rules of reciprocity, right? Once you have a state, you got to fulfill your promises and all that. If you don't have a state, not so much. You should, maybe-ish, but, you know, it's not as important, okay? So that's Thomas Hobbes' version of the state of nature. It's ugly, right? It's a dystopia, we could call it, okay? John Locke has a much nicer view of the state of nature. We're going to return to John Locke's view more in depth in a later lecture, but I just want to highlight some of the big differences here between Locke and Hobbes. So John Locke's definitely like probably top 5, certainly top 10 philosophers of all time. Thomas Hobbes is really important, but he kind of wrote one book that was important. John Locke wrote a bunch of books that were important. He's still terribly important. So, you know, John Locke, he's a biggie. But, you know, Locke is very critical, actually, of Hobbes' notion of the state of nature. Notice how John Locke draws a strong distinction between a state of nature and a state of war, okay? John Locke thinks a state of war only happens when there's a very clear sign that someone's trying to take my stuff. All other times, we're pretty much okay, sort of state of peace. John Locke also thinks that justice exists in nature, right? So, same idea with the state of nature. There's no government. We're doing a thought experiment, blah, blah, blah. But John Locke says, no, you know, though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. So there are rules of justice that apply in the state of nature. Critically, hugely important difference between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. So, we have two sort of natural capabilities for John Locke in a state of nature. We have reason, which he thinks gives us this law of justice and morality, which is natural law, okay? And we also have property, which is John Locke says we have property in our person. We'll read the more extended version later. What you get here is mostly the stuff on reason, a little bit, and that kind of stuff. Okay? But the property is actually very important for a later lecture. So, the state of nature, Locke argues, has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Reason says, be cool. But all is not well. So Locke has a much nicer version of the state of nature. We don't have to be nearly as fearful of one another. Thank goodness reason's there, and reason actually gives us justice. It tells us what justice is. The problem for Locke is that it's hard to make justice happen in a state of nature. So it's there, but there's certain inconveniences. There we go. Inconveniences is what Locke says, and we're going to talk about some of these inconveniences. First, all people have the right to execute the law of nature. That means if someone steals your stuff, you or one of your friends has the right to go get it back. One, the right of reparation, get it back. Two, the right of punishment, right? So that's, you stole my stuff, now I'm going to punish you. Notice you're also here, you're not allowed to be vengeful in doing this. Your punishment has to be proportional to the crime, but there's a problem here. We're not neutral judges, and there's actually there's another problem here, which is that, you know, if the guy's bigger than you, that's a real inconvenience to go get your stuff back because he's bigger than you, and how are you going to deal with that one, right? So what Locke calls our self-love, or what we today think of as our ego, gets in the way. We are poor judges in our own case, right? Which is going to lead to a lot of conflict, right? We have reason, and reason works most of the time. It gives us a lot of good stuff. But when the rubber hits the road, reason has a problem, which is that it's not perfect, and we get hung up on our own stuff. You know, people think People go, something, the stock market crashes, they go, why is this happening to me, right? Like it's only happening to you, and like God decided I'm punishing this person here with a stock market crash. But it's not happening just to you, it's happening to all of us, right? That's what Locke would say. Like, look, it's not just you, self-love, ego, it's not happening to you, okay? Okay, so to Locke, when we live under government, what happens is we give up the right to be executor of the right of nature, but we get to keep all of our other rights, okay? So Locke has also identified through his state of nature certain other things you get to keep. So for example, property is a very important natural right to John Locke, okay? And the state also has to obey the laws of nature, right? So when you've identified reason exists, it gives us these laws of nature. When you're in the state of nature, you have to follow them, and if you don't, you get to punish the offender. We give that right, the right to punish the offenders of the laws of nature, to the state, but they're not exempt from that either, right? So the state gets to hold that right for the time being, but they're not exempt from it either. The state only makes the laws of nature more secure. So that's pretty much where sort of Locke concludes, right? Notice this is a pretty big criticism of Hobbes. The state is a lot more limited. The right of nature has a lot more secure. The state of nature has a lot more security. Natural law exists independent of political power, so it has to be enforced. It's kind of always operative. There you go. Let's talk about Montesquieu. So Montesquieu has a different criticism of Hobbes' notion of the state of nature. And Montesquieu's actually coming here from a more Republican point of view, but we're on the state of nature, so I wanted to include some of these slides, okay? Natural laws, for Montesquieu, notice his criticism, must be man before the establishment of society. The laws received in such a state would be those of nature. Right? So then what is Montesquieu's next move? He says, look, first we would have the faculty of knowing, but no knowledge. So we would be able to know things, but we wouldn't have developed systems of math or literature or all of this. And this ignorance would actually lead to fear. And so peace would be the first law of nature, right? So this is a huge criticism of Hobbes, where Hobbes says, look, what a state of nature is, we're all just scared of each other all the time. And Montesquieu's saying, no, actually, if we really were consistent in what our state of nature means, we would not only have to look at people without a government, but we would also have to look at how they would behave and act before having a bunch of socially constructed notions of what is right, what is wrong, systems of math and ethics and all these things that take literally generations to make happen, right? Like no settled law, all of this kind of stuff. Only society, right? So peace would be the first law of nature. We'd be ignorant, and so we wouldn't actually want to start fights. And only society gives men motives for hostile attacks. Second law would be law of food, right? So we would want to find food and work together to find food. And so the natural fear would actually lead people to slowly begin to associate. Montesquieu says we would see that they were also afraid of us, and then in our mutual fear we would say, hey, why should we be scared of each other? I'm scared of you, you're scared of me. We don't need to be scared of each other. We can begin to associate and live together. There's a kind of natural pleasure of association. The third law, right? Montesquieu's a good Republican, okay? So the third law is family life and sexual attraction. The natural inclination they have for each other would form a third law, right? Family. Finally, Montesquieu concludes with this. Men have the advantage of acquired knowledge, and thence arises a second tie, a new motive for uniting, and a fourth law of nature results from the desire of living in a society, right? Desire to live in a society is what? A natural law. So Montesquieu is saying, look, Hobbes, all your state of nature stuff, if you reconstruct it properly, it just looks a lot like Aristotle's first analysis that I went through 15 minutes ago or whatever, okay? You end up basically, society is natural, right? Fourth natural law is what? We would have not just families, but a bigger society. It's a Republican critique of the entire notion of the state of nature. So Rousseau's also a Republican. He's building off of Montesquieu in this case, but Rousseau's criticism is more developed, okay? Rousseau actually has a huge, it's a 120-page book, basically entirely criticizing how Locke and Hobbes put together their state of nature. To Rousseau, in nature, persons are neither good or bad. Criteria of good and bad are socially produced criteria, but there is a kind of cry of nature which makes us have an aversion to pain and to recognize pain in others. Looks very similar to Montesquieu's use of fear and how that went down. Rousseau thinks Hobbes confuses two things, right, that need to be kept separate. First, what Rousseau calls amour de soi, love of the self, which is self-preservation, right? Like physical pain, pleasure and pain, self-preservation. That's one thing, more basic. And then, oops, it's misspelled, amour propre, it should be P-R-E, I think my spell check fixed it for me, because it's French. Social esteem and ego, but this is social in origin, right? So it's our ego, but our ego is actually very social. It's our desire to be seen as smart, our desire to be seen as funny, a desire to be seen as good or bad, right? The first of these types of self-love is natural and not bad. The second is social and leads to conflict. This is also a criticism of John Locke. Okay, so that's Rousseau. You should use that to help you with your homework a little bit. Foundation number 3, Marxism. So we have 2 readings for this week on Marxist sort of analysis, Robert Owen and Karl Marx. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about Owen. You want to stay really focused on Marx himself. Notice how Owen's main argument is that nature is malleable depending on how social incentives of praise and blame work, right? Look at the list on page 24. Robert Owen is a kind of social utopianist almost. But his basic argument is that the social nature of man is far more important than any of these natural things. I mean, he would even probably criticize Rousseau on the self-preservation thing. And if you get the incentives right, you can get people to do pretty much anything, okay? Early version of like scientific management, which is people like, who was it, Taylor, I forget what his last name was. But Robert Owen's not a particularly great Marxist. I mean, he's in the same sort of broad family, but he's not a good Marxist. So let's do Marxism by Marx, which is more important. We want to stay focused on this through the semester. Karl Marx, I think, is quite a bit more persuasive than Owen. The Marxist foundation is this. It's man is productive being, or sometimes called homo faber, or also is linked to this idea of mode of production. Okay, so it's kind of homo faber / mode of production is his foundation. Look at this quote. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. Okay, let me give you an example. But basically, how you work affects your mental state. Many human societies have lived in relatively nomadic lives, moving from place to place, hunting animals and gathering plants. We call them hunter-gatherers. We can call this the hunter-gatherer style of life a mode of production, right? They have a way in which they're interacting with the material world, hunting and gathering. And with that mode of production comes a bunch of other habits, feelings, and ideas that match or are appropriate to this material condition, right? So if we were hunter-gatherers and we're out on horses a lot, we could think of it as the habits of horseback. If you've seen movies like Dances with Wolves or, movies that actually portray Native American lifestyles somewhat realistically, you might get something, you might be sort of have a popular culture way of seeing what I'm talking about. Notice mode of production is not only how you get resources, but also a kind of social life that comes along with it. There's habits and feelings that are appropriate to that material way of life. So put differently, your mental states are mostly caused by your material way of producing goods. Now that's a historical example. Let's take a look at contemporary life, capitalism, right? The capitalist mode of production. This is where Karl Marx begins his arguments today. Marx argues that in capitalist society, the dominant social relation mode of production is that of owner and worker, what he calls bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? But bourgeoisie are people who own stuff. They have lots of money, they own the factories, they're stockholders, blah, blah, blah. Proletariat are people who work in the factories, workers. I like owner and workers. Owners have capital and workers have labor. The basic capitalist relation is workers sell their labor on a free market to capitalists in exchange for a wage. Note, other social systems have different ways of making trades, right? Just period, it's very simple, i.e. lords and peasants, hunters and gatherers, right? So these are all going to look very different. The trade in feudalism was protection for obedience. The trade in capitalism is money for labor, right? Anyways, the point from this basic analysis is Karl Marx was able to predict quite a lot of amazing things, including recurring economic crises of capitalism, booms and busts, the declining wages of workers, and even the origins of monopolies, right? Pretty impressive. He did all this stuff about 200 years ago, okay? Really good little article here. This is Rolling Stone, so it's just kind of a pop piece, but kind of to give you a sense of what some of the power of Marx is, right? He's limited, he's not perfect, but he also is doing a few things really well. So, here's another example of things Marx predicted that turned out to be true. Rising inequality in capitalism. And you may have heard of this famous book called Capital in the 21st Century. It's by this guy, Thomas Piketty. Basically, he shows that one of Marx's most important insights is still true today, okay? That inequality rises in capitalism. This doesn't mean Marx is right about everything, but he's right about an awful lot. You don't believe me? This is a chart from the American Enterprise Institute. They hate Karl Marx, okay? And they're proving Marx right. They don't mean to be. They did it on accident. I just happened to find this, and so I threw it into my lecture, right? But notice what's the argument here. Global income inequality, they think global income inequality is on the decline, but here's what's happening. This line here with the plunge right at the end that goes down here, that's what? That's inequality between nations. That's inequality between the United States and China, US and Mexico, Germany and Japan, all the different countries is declining. So if we compare sort of wages and all that between all the different countries, it looks like they're coming closer together. On the other hand, see this spike over here? Inequality within nations is increasing rather rapidly. What's this telling us? As countries are developing capitalistically, they're looking more and more like Europe and the United States and Japan, which are already advanced capitalistic countries. Okay, so you're already looking a little bit more like that. And then what comes along with that, with economic development? Higher rates of economic inequality. Okay, so it's happening. China is one of the big drivers because China is developing very rapidly and they're so big. So a lot of this is actually just driven by China, but China, it's exactly what Marx would predict, this, okay? So this is just my brief Marxist conclusion, right? We're going to have to do more on this and come back to this later, but the biggest consequence of but this is our basic analysis. The biggest consequence of the capitalist mode of production is that it creates a class structure built from bourgeoisie, owner, and proletariat worker. This class structure is the fundamental, call it the base, driver of political and cultural life. Owners get richer, workers get poorer. This is a big problem for Marx. Is politics really simply derived or caused by economics? Marx really thought that the economic laws, that in general, economic laws were the drivers of history and politics and culture, and he's not entirely wrong by that, but is it a direct sort of causation, or are there some other things going on that complicate the story? So this is a big problem with Marx. He's got a few things that he's doing that are like just great and amazing, but he's not seeing everything, okay? So let's look back at our summation, okay? School 1, Republicanism, Aristotle, Rousseau, Montesquieu. The foundation is man is a social or political animal. I actually cut out a couple of these. I'm going to talk about them later, but the key terms are telos, tradition, civic virtue. I'll talk about tradition and civic virtue later. I meant to throw in a slide before getting going, and I realized halfway through, but I didn't want to waste a half an hour. Liberalism, foundation, respect due to an individual endowed with reason, individual rights. Key terms, natural law, state of nature, reason. School number 3, Marxism, foundation, the capitalist mode of production / homo faber, man the maker. Key terms, bourgeoisie, proletariat, social class. The end. Hope you had a nice time. This was our first lecture for Introduction to Political Theory. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to get online and do lots of participating.